Good morning. I apologize for speaking English, but there are competent translators who have to work much harder than I have during this talk, so I'm very grateful for them, and I hope that through that we can manage to have some communication. I also have a PowerPoint with quite a lot of text, so maybe that also helps in reading along. I will talk about the topic of the beautiful risk of innovation. My own background is that of a teacher and teacher educator in higher education in a number of different countries. I also write quite a lot about education that is visible in a number of countries. And for the past 4 years, I've also been advising the Dutch government and parliament. And I'm always curious what's happening with education in many countries, including Italy. What I want to talk about today is the relationship between school and society through the lens, you could say, of innovation. And I want to raise a number of questions about what I see going on in a number of countries, and maybe you recognize some of that, so I hope it's a useful contribution. To start with innovation, I think that many people who work in education see that there is a constant demand for innovation. You could even say there is a pressure to innovate, which has something to do with the idea that we should renew. And we've just seen the history of that idea of making things new. Now, one area where I think this whole question of innovation shows some of its problems is the field of fashion. I don't know whether anyone in the room knows this company. Anyone? You probably know its biggest shop, Zara, and they are the owners of it. And what is interesting is that this company is not just the biggest fashion company in the world, but it's also the fastest fashion company in the world. They only need about 2 weeks to design something and have it in the shops. Their collections are not a spring collection and a winter collection. Every 4 weeks they have new collections, and they keep pushing an enormous amount of new clothing into their shops. And you can say that is the way they make money. Fast fashion, in order to constantly stimulate customers to go to the shops, and they count how often people visit their shops, and it's significantly more than in other shops. But this raises the first question. It's an obvious one, but important to ask. Is what is new also better? And there are quite a lot of concerns nowadays about the fashion industry, that it's reaching a limit by just chasing the new. Our demand for novelty is killing designers and the planet. And I wondered how that feels in education. So the real question, you could say, is not a question of innovation, but it's the question of improvement. And that's, of course, what people who want to innovate are after. And again, you can say in education there is now a constant push, a constant demand for improvement to make education better. And here we encounter some really big questions. The questions, what is better? Who defines what is better? And who decides what is better? And there, over the past 10 or 20 years, we have seen some very strong voices that say to improve education is a matter of measuring, particularly measuring test scores, league table positions, learning outcomes. So it looks like measurement is giving us the answer to the question, what is better? But again, in measurement, there is a big question. Do we use measurement in order to make a judgment about what we value? Or are we slowly in another position where the things that are being measured are simply taken as the things we should be valuing? And this is what I see happening a lot, for example, when OECD brings its annual report. They call it Education at a Glance, but they need almost 300 pages just to give a glance of education. There is also a question whether the education is actually possible. And this is just a statistical fact that at some point you reach a plateau. So if we constantly say to schools, you have to improve, tomorrow has to be better than today, you wonder where that is going to end. So perhaps we should also not be pushing for improvement, but take on a challenge that I think is more honest, but also quite difficult. The challenge to make sure that there is good education for everyone. That means, among other things, that we should be mindful that education doesn't get worse. So you can say maintaining the status quo is already tremendously hard and difficult work. And a lot of that work is happening every day in schools. That ambition to make sure that there is good education for everyone, you can say, is a very different way to talk about what matters in education. And it's also a different task that focuses slightly differently from constantly improving, constantly raising test scores, getting higher up into the league table, without asking what is actually happening here and now in front of our eyes. Now I can play with these words, innovation, improvement, good education, but you will immediately come back to me and say, but what is good education? How can we give meaning to that idea? And for that, of course, in education, we need a sense of direction. And I want to make a number of observations about this sense of direction and what is happening there in the relationship between schools or colleges or universities on the one hand and society on the other hand. One thing I find interesting is I read a lot of reports from all kinds of organizations from all over the world that all write about the future of education and what good education is. And what I find remarkable is that on the opening pages of these reports, almost all reports tell the same story. And I just want to check whether you will recognize that story. So we read something like this. Society is changing at a very high pace. And people refer to globalization, digitalization, the technology, individualization, and so on. All kinds of izations, you could say. Then people say, because things are changing so fast, we do not know what the future will look like. Now that looks like a very profound statement, but you can also say that's the definition of the word future. It is what is to come. But often a conclusion is linked to that, to say the knowledge we have today will therefore quickly be outdated. People also say, and I'm thinking back about the pictures we just saw, we are using a 20th century or a 19th century education system to prepare students for the 21st century. So I also read that in these first pages. And then it builds up to a conclusion where people say, we need to completely change education. You may recognize this or not. And often what is said is we need to shift education towards skills, not this old knowledge that will change very rapidly. For example, 21st century skills, an interesting label, so that students with these skills can adjust flexibly to this rapidly changing environment. Now you probably have these television shows in Italy where you then have a box and you can vote true or false. It would be very nice to do that here. Is this story true or is this story false? I would say the problem with stories like these is that they are half true. So there is some truth, but you can also say it's not the whole picture. So let's have a quick look. This idea that society is changing at a very high pace. If you look in a particular direction, particular parts of society, particular countries, you can indeed see an awful lot of change, and it goes on at a really high pace. But if you look in another direction, at another aspect of society, or in different countries, there is actually hardly any change happening at all. Many people who every day still struggle to find clean water, clean sanitation, enough food, and a job in order to sustain their lives. So it's only half true to say that everything is changing fast. The same with this idea. We do not know what the future will look like because changes are going so fast, and the knowledge we have today is not helpful for that future. And in some domains that's true. The world of work is changing rapidly. The whole idea of automation, of robots, that is happening, although also the Starbucks, the coffee economy is going all over the world. Very low paid jobs with little job security. That's also changing in the world of work. So although we do not know what the future will look like, I'm happy to make a prediction about what will still be really important things in 50 years from now. Here are three. I think in 50 years from now, the question of democracy, how do we manage to live together if we find it important that we are not all the same or think the same, will be a really important question. Ecology. How do we manage to maintain our lives on a planet that is already close to being exhausted and overheated? It will be even a bigger problem in 50 years from now. And care. How are we going to care for each other, particularly for the elderly? And we all know that many of us will live longer than generations before us. So just to say we do not know anything about the future is a dangerous idea. And also to say all the knowledge we have from the past will not be valid in the future is quite a problematic idea. That these themes will be there is because they have to do with human life and human living together. And these questions keep coming back. Why am I saying this? Because my bigger theme is the relationship between society and education. And what I see is quite a strong tendency to say what we need to give children, students, young people are the skills to adapt to what is going on around them. And when you begin to look on the internet, as I did last night, skills for the future, 21st century skills, you see lots of lists passing by. This is one list that again many of you will probably recognize. Critical thinking, collaboration, adaptability, initiative, effective communication, analyzing information, curiosity and imagination. This comes from Harvard University, so prestigious university. And interestingly, they don't call these 21st century skills, but they call them survival skills. And that's where I see a problem, because I think that survival may not be the most important sense of direction, the most important point of orientation we need. If you look very carefully at these skills and think what is missing here, you can say what is missing here is to pay attention to the question, what do we do once we have all these skills? Because all these skills are also very useful if you want to build a nuclear bomb. And this, I find, the biggest blind spot in a lot of skills, that you can say the skill that is missing, but the question is that just another skill that we add to the list? Or does this ask something else from us? Is the question, what do we do with this? Do we use these skills for the good or for evil? And even the question of a nuclear bomb is not an easy one, because the nuclear bomb is not just evil. We also live in a history where the nuclear bomb has created the world we are in. So these are very difficult questions that I think if we just get our sense of directions from adjusting to what happens around us may be missing. Questions like not what can I do here, but what is this asking from me? The question, should I go with the flow or should I resist? Should I say yes? Should I say no? You can call them moral questions, but as an educator I would say these are actually fundamental educational questions. That is why I would say, and here I just quote from a lovely book by a French educational scholar, Philippe Mérieux, who says education is not just there to do what other people want from it. Education actually has a duty to resist as well. And I want to look at a few dimensions of this duty to resist. And I'm keeping an eye on the clock. The idea that education is not just there to adapt or adjust to what other people want from it has something to do with what you could call the double history of the school. And again, I really enjoyed to start with sort of a historical outlook at what has happened with the school over the past century. When you look at the books that try to make sense of the history of the modern school, you often find this idea. The idea that the modern school emerges at a point in time when society sort of loses its educative quality. For a long time, the new generation, children, young people, could learn everything they needed to learn by just hanging around. And that was possible because most of the life was farming life, for example. So growing up on a farm, you could immediately see what you need to become the next generation of farmers. If work is done at home, again, you can just see and pick a lot up by hanging around. That's still how children learn language, for example. But when societies begin to modernize, when work, for example, moves to factories and offices, the new generation can no longer simply see what they need to know, and then schools begin to develop as the places where we prepare the next generation for their future. Now, this is part of the history of the school we are still in, and you can say here the school has a clear job for society, it is a function for society, and you can also say that is why society looks at the school and says, are you doing this job well for us? Are you preparing the next generation so that they will be good workers, good citizens, and so on? And a lot of the measurement is trying to do that. Can we measure whether the school is performing its function? So partly this is our job as educators. But we should never forget that there is a second history of the school. And in a sense, it's a much older history where you can say, what is the school? The school is this strange place halfway between home, school is not home, and the street, the real world, the place, and maybe also the time we give to the next generation in order to meet the world, to explore the world, and also meet themselves and explore themselves. The school, you can say here, is a place where we can practice, where we can try out, but where we can also fail and try again. The school is therefore not a place of work. If we want work from our students, we should pay them a salary. So you have to look very carefully. In some countries they talk about school as work, but then I think, let's be honest, and let's pay our students for the work. But rather the school is this place where we can explore, make mistakes, practice. Here, the school actually needs to be shielded off from the demands of society, so that we give the new generation time to make this step into the world. And this, you can say, is the tension, or maybe even the dilemma of the contemporary school, that on the one hand we must serve society, but on the other hand we must also serve the new generation and give them the time to make this step into society. I said that this was an older history because the Greek word for school, schola, actually means free time. Time that is not yet claimed by society. Really interesting in all the languages that still use the word school to connect to that. So you can say there is a tension at the heart of the modern school. I often call this the tension of the school being a servant of two masters, which is an Italian play, and in other countries I always ask, do people know it? And they say, we don't know it. I don't know whether you know it or not, but I'm making a plug for Carlo Goldoni here. What is the problem that many people in education experience, teachers, but also policymakers, and in a sense also politicians? They all say the current system is out of balance because the first master, the master that says the school is for our society, you have to do the job and we'll measure it constantly, that master has gained a much louder voice than the second master, the master that says the school is there to give the next generation time. And when I try to find an image of how that feels, I really like this image. This is how many people say it's out of balance. It's too much asking on the one side, and therefore we cannot even get traction to take care of the other bit as well. So this is where the question of the sense of direction comes in again. Not in order to say we have nothing to do with society. I think these were the extremes of the new school movement in the beginning of the 20th century that says it's only about the child. I think that's a mistake, but it's about society and also about the new generation. So what might be possible in order to get a better balance here? Here is one suggestion, and in my writing I keep coming up with different suggestions in all kinds of ways. One thing we could do in talking about the relationship between school and society is to ask a different question. This is the question that many people see as the normal, logical, acceptable question. What kind of school does society need? And when you look at the history of educational innovation, this is the main trend. Society is changing, so what kind of school do we need to serve society in that? I want to put another question there, at least in order to have an alternative, or two questions. It's a really interesting one. I didn't come up with it, a German colleague did. The question, what kind of society does the school actually need in order to be a school and not just this servant of society? So rather than constantly saying, school, you need to do what we want to do, we should look back at ourselves and say, as a society, are we still allowing the school to perform this other important task as well? Now maybe we can see societies where this question is seriously taken up. You may have heard of Bhutan, a very small country, that actually said, rather than measuring our GDP, our economic output, we want to have a happiness index, because that's what we believe is really important. But many of the societies in which we live our lives are not like that. They are driven by other priorities, and particularly economic priorities. Now, a brilliant book that I would really recommend if you want to get a fresh, but I would also say an educationally interesting perspective on our times and our society, is a book written by an American writer called The Impulse Society. And the book has a very telling subtitle where he says, what is wrong with getting what we want? And he shows chapter after chapter what is wrong, what goes wrong when we create a society where we are only after getting what we want, but never ask the question whether what we want is what we should be wanting. Here's a quick example to get into it. I confess I have this thing, an Apple iPhone. What is brilliant about Apple, I would say, Apple doesn't sell mobile phones. You may think they sell mobile phones. That's not what they do. What's brilliant about Apple is that they sell the desire for a new mobile phone. And they sell that desire for free. But once that desire has sort of entered us somewhere, we suddenly find ourselves in a shop or on the internet to buy the next model iPhone. So we live in an economy that is constantly, through all kind of clever advertising, is saying you have to desire more, you have to desire our products, rather than that it asks the question whether all these desires are the desires we should be having. The same in politics, where there are a lot of politicians that now say during elections, if you vote for me, I will give you everything you desire. Donald Trump, I'll build a wall, I'll do this, 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 and this. And of course, we know that not everything that politicians promise is possible. But that is often what you see happening in modern politics. It also plays on desires, rather than to say, if you vote for me, we will look at your desires through this set of political values, which is different than if you vote for the other candidate, who will look at your desires in relation to this set of political values. So this whole question of just pursuing desires has become quite central in modern societies. And this brings us back, I would say, to an old educational theme, the question what we do with our desires, and the question how we help our children, our young people, to come into a relationship with their desires. And one word we can use for that, but I haven't found the perfect word in any language, is to talk about the question of grown-upness. But I don't want to think of grown-upness as the outcome of a development where you say, I've been around for 18 years and now for the rest of my life I will be grown up. I want to think of grown-upness as a way in which we try to live our lives and educationally try to encourage children to live their lives. It is a life where we are not just running behind our desires. You can say running behind your desires is actually an infantile way of living your life, but I don't want to sort of blame children for that. I see actually many people with big bodies who are just running behind their desires, and that's quite dangerous at a global scale. To try to live in a grown-up way is constantly to come back to this question, is what I desire, is that what I should be desiring? Is that going to help me to lead a good life? Is it going to help us to live a good life together? And also on a planet that has already been telling us for years and years that it cannot give us everything we want. The ecological crisis is a question of desires. And here you can say we find the work of education. It is to resist infantile desires, or you can say it's to help children, young people, but maybe also ourselves, to constantly keep a relationship to our desires. This is not the work of suppressing desires. There is old bad pedagogy that says desires are bad, and if you get rid of your desires, everything will be fine. We need our desires because desires give us the energy to engage with the difficulties of living together. It's also not about telling students what they should be desiring. That's the problem with the transmission model of education, when it becomes moralizing and say, okay, you desire this, but I'm going to tell you that is what you should be desiring. Because that doesn't help children to come into their own relationship with desires. What we should do as educators, as school, is constantly, in all kind of ways, come back to that question, is what you desire, what you should be desiring? And that's a very difficult question. And what we hope to do there is, by working on that question, actually arouse a desire in the next generation to want to make this step into the world, not just running behind their own desires, but always putting that in the perspective of living together on this planet. And this work is very risky because we do not know what it leads to. It's asking a difficult question, a question that interrupts, but I think this is the central educational question. There is a nice quote from an Indian scholar, Spivak, who says, this is actually a nice definition of education, that we are constantly trying to rearrange our desires, to meet our desires and figure out what do we want with them, which can help us and which are going to hinder us. When you look at education in that way, it becomes a very different process from what we hear nowadays a lot. So you can say, if we should also ask this difficult question in education, education is not just there to let everyone flourish and develop all their talents. Education always interrupts a little. In the countries where I work, I see many schools who promise parents that if you send your child to our school, we will help them to develop all their talents. And I think that's a dangerous message, because when we're honest, we know that we have talents to do beautiful things, but to be a criminal also requires talent. So the real thing is not let everything develop, but to interrupt and say which of these talents are actually the ones that are going to help. To work on that question needs time, and therefore education needs to give that time. Education actually needs to slow down, and that goes against the idea of a lot of innovation that says the faster you can do it, the better. If you don't need the school but can do it on internet, go for the internet. That misses the point that education is precisely this time, this attention we vote to what it means to live life well. Curriculum has an important role to play there. And if that is also the work we do as educators, we need, of course, to provide support. I use a very old English word, sustenance, which means support, but also nourishment, to keep our students with those difficult questions. Often because what looks unattractive in the short term may become important in the longer term. That brings me to my concluding comments. So the title was The Beautiful Risk of Innovation, and I've tried to raise some questions about that, maybe some irritating or interruptive questions by saying, well, it's not all beauty in innovation. We have to be very mindful of the direction and the reasons for innovation. And you can say the risk of innovation is that we keep constantly running behind what people outside of education want from us, and that's part of our job. But forget that there is another job to do as well, to help the next generation to gain a sense of direction in this wild, fast-changing world around them. If we are only in an adaptive mode, you could say, education forgets or becomes unable to ask whether all the desires that come into the classroom and all these desires created by Apple and other companies are also in the classroom, whether we can work on the question whether those desires should be the ones we should be pursuing. And for that we need education that slows down, that shields off, that not just goes with the flow, but also understands that it needs to resist. That's why you could say, and of course I'm playing with words in order to challenge or push the conversation a little, that education should not just be innovative, should not just have an orientation towards the new, but should also be conservative, should also conserve things from the past that are of value. And the most beautiful quote I found to make this visible is from an American educational thinker, George Counts, who says, "I'm a conservative because I believe in the conservation of radical ideas." And I think that is where, as educators, we should keep encouraging ourselves that we have an important contribution to make and that we are not just there to serve what's going around us. Thanks for your attention, and I hope it worked in translation, so also thanks very much to the interpreters for helping with that.